Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Raymond Robertson, and I am a professor of economics and government at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. It's a great pleasure of mine to be sharing this hour with you tonight, for most of you, to talk about the future of work. And I'd like to point out that I'd like to thank the organizers of the American Moscow Center in Moscow because the theme, of course, of the center is learn, connect, and produce. And it turns out that those are the things that you need in order to be successful in the future of work. So what I'd like to do today or tonight is to go through some ideas about how people are thinking about the future of work and maybe get to some of your questions near the end of the talk. So I'm hoping to be provocative. I'm hoping to stir up some questions that you might have. But I'd like to make a couple of disclaimers before I begin. First of all, I'm an economist, and economists are notoriously boring. And so I'm hoping to hold on to your attention with the quality of the ideas that we'll be discussing, because I think the ideas are very interesting. But secondly, I would also like to point out that as an economist, I've known many of my colleagues who make a lot of money by forecasting the future and telling people how they think the future is going to unfold. And that's a little bit of what I've been asked to do with you tonight. But I just want to make it crystal clear that as an economist, I have no magical powers. I don't have a crystal ball. I am not a wizard or a warlock, and I do not have the ability to see into the future much better than any of you might. Although some of you may have magical powers, I don't know. I can't say for sure that you don't. But I will point out that what economists are very good at is understanding trends and what are some of the key trends that seem to be really dominating our thoughts about the future of work. So the first thing I would like to do is just have a plug for economics in general, because as I said, people are usually very aware or skeptical or even frightened of economics. But I would like to suggest that economics is actually key for civic participation, especially when we're thinking about interacting with other countries. Most of our interactions with each other and other countries are commercial, right? You see each other at the store, the mall, getting bread, going to work, trade, investment, migration. And this has been a dominant characteristic of what we do in our jobs is engaging with the global economy. The global economy is incredibly important. Global trade was hit a record of 32 trillion in 2022, but in 2023 there's been some more pessimistic outlooks, and we see that even into 2024. I'm going to talk a lot about the United States economy because that's my main point of reference. You know, the United States economy is about 25.6 trillion, and it's really critical, I think, for the United States, for Russia, for all of our neighbors, that we really understand economics and how economies work and how we interact, not necessarily just on a macro scale, but even on a micro scale. Our work relationships are actually also largely explained by economic principles. So if you're thinking about foreign relations, if you're thinking about the future of work or economics, right, it's really important to think about the economic concepts that basically guide how we interact with countries. Kind of to extrapolate on that a little bit, I would like to point out the importance of global trade. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because we are at a point in history where people are a little bit more pessimistic about the global economy. And I realize that it's difficult in many cases to engage as much as we want. But I wanted to make it very clear that globalization and interacting with other countries economically really contributes to growth. And that trade and industrial production since 1960, as you see in this slide, are very closely related. And one of the key lessons from this is that when we think about the future of work, we want to think more and more about how do we engage with other countries, where are opportunities for not just work for our companies necessarily, right? Want to contribute to a company or even other type of organizations, but for yourself. And I'm going to make the argument that as we go forward, investing in yourself and engaging more as an independent contractor and thinking of yourself as more of an independent worker is increasingly important. And if you're able to gather those skills and invest in yourself, which is something I'll probably repeat many times during this time we have together, thinking about how to use your skills in the global economy will be especially productive for you. So how do we reach out and engage with other countries, either in terms of inputs, like how do we get the resources we need to produce those things that we'd like to sell, or how do you market yourself as someone with skills to other companies around the world who might also be very interested in engaging with you on a commercial way, like hiring you to do those things that you're really good at. The other point of this graph, of course, is that, as I said, there has been a sense of global pessimism in the last decade, basically since 2014. And people are becoming increasingly skeptical of the future of globalization. And one of the things I'm hoping to convince you of is that globalization is not going away, that globalization still remains a very important part, and we still have a lot of potential in the global economy, even though there is a growing pessimism around the world for how productive it is to engage with other countries. So I would still encourage you to not buy in to that pessimism about globalization. And when you're thinking about the future of your work, to think about how to engage not just in your local communities, but globally. Okay, so as we jump in, that's sort of the ground background I'd like to provide. But as we jump in, one of the things I'd like to begin with is just a couple of key points about how do we think about the future of work. I've already mentioned that I'm not a forecaster per se. I'm not someone who is going to tell you with certainty what's going to happen. I know that the weather forecasters all around the world are very grateful for economists because weather forecasters look much better when their forecasts are compared to those that economists make. And so economists are not necessarily the best forecasters. So I want to just issue a lot of caution. And if you are interested in knowing what the future is going to be by watching this talk, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I want to get that right out in front right away. So there are some limits to economic forecasting. The second thing, though, that I'd like to emphasize is, how do we think about the economy, right? I mean, when we think about the future of work, we really need to know where the economy is going and what we mean by that, and whether or not these are, good times or bad times around the world. There's growing pessimism about economic performance, and there's a growing pessimism about globalization. And I've asked students in the United States about if they think the economy is doing well or if it's doing poorly. And in the United States, many students say that the economy is not doing well. So that leads us to this question about what are the key economic challenges facing us, not just the United States and Russia, but around the world, including these international economic challenges. And so I'm hoping that we can think a little bit about them when we're thinking about the future of work. So the first thing is measuring the economy. And the key thing I'd like to point out here is if any of you have ever taken an economics course and you've heard the term macroeconomics, right? Macroeconomics is the part of economics that talks about the economy more broadly. And in macroeconomics, we think about the economy really in two different ways. And we can think about it in the short run, or we could think about it in the long run. And in the long run, what we really mean when we think about the economy in the long run is economic growth. And this is, for example, why some countries are richer than others, why some countries grow faster than others continuously year after year after year, and what are the determinants or what are the factors that contribute to a country's economic growth. That's one key stream. And I'm going to tell you right now that if you're interested in studying economics more in depth, I can give you the answer to the secrets behind economic growth right now. It's actually not that much of a secret, and it's not about the future, so I feel comfortable telling you this, but it's basically endowments, which is the amount of capital you have, the amount of machines you have, the kind of machines, and technology. And those are the key things that determine a country's economic growth. And the reason why I'm mentioning that in a discussion about the future of work is that technology is changing rapidly. And one of the key questions people have about the future of work is how is this changing technology going to be affecting our work relationships and productivity, and basically whether or not people will continue to have jobs. And I'm going to be addressing that in more detail, obviously, as we go forward. But the second thing that people think about when they think about the economy is the short run, and that really involves business cycles. And business cycles are demonstrated in this figure by the unemployment rate. And I'm demonstrating here just the US civilian unemployment rate. And what you see are two key things. Number one is that the economy in the short run goes through business cycles. There's periods of expansion, there's periods of contraction. And I like to think about the measurement of whether or not we're in good times or bad times by looking at the unemployment rate, which is directly related to how we think about work. Can you get a job? And how easy is it to get a job? Can you hold on to a job? Can you find a new job? A lot of that environment for those questions is shaped by the unemployment rate. And in the United States, we see that just like every economy, we go through business cycles, that there's periods of high unemployment, low unemployment. And this graph captures the two most recent, what we call business cycles in the United States. And one was during the 2007-2009 global financial crisis that led to a very significant increase in unemployment rates. People lost their jobs, and we had almost 10% unemployment. And then, of course, as everyone knows, we had the COVID-19 crisis, which led to a very rapid, almost within a month, a huge spike in unemployment rates, but then a dramatic drop. And so now what people are thinking about when they think about the future of work is this post-COVID economy, because you can see two things also about the COVID crisis in this graph. Number one is that the unemployment rates came down, so there was a very rapid recovery from COVID in terms of unemployment. And then secondly, and this is still true in the United States is still at historically low unemployment rates. So I realize that many countries around the world, and many regions, Europe, Russia, even many parts of Africa, Latin America, are stagnating somewhat. But one of the characteristics of the US economy at this particular point is that unemployment is at historically low levels. And you can see that it's kind of leveled off and may have even started to turn up a little bit. I actually think that it has started to turn up, and that's not a prediction, that's just an empirical observation from the data from March. So, but the fact that it's at very low levels actually is important when we think about the short-term future, right? Because this means that there are job shortages, that skills are needed, and businesses are interested in finding workers to basically meet the needs that they have within their company, and they might be looking abroad. And that's part of the reason why we see that the job shortages in the United States are actually being transmitted to other countries. And I have a research work in progress that I could talk about with that. But also that job shortage in the United States creates opportunities both for migrants who want to go to the United States, but also for people around the world who are hoping to engage with the U.S. economy. So in the short run, we see that there is a lot of labor demand in the United States, but obviously less so in other parts of the world. And again, we can talk more about that at the end if you like. One of the things I mentioned was that unemployment rates represent the business cycles, and here are 5 of the last U.S. business cycles, and you can see the very significant difference between COVID in terms of the rapid rise and the rapid fall. Most of these business cycles are much slower. They're more gradual increases and decreases, and right now we're still in this very significant period of low unemployment, and it's been, not counting COVID, right? If you don't count that, which was really a natural disaster, we're in one of the longest expansions in the United States that we've had in a very long time. But the COVID recession is not typical. And the key thing about that is that it changed work significantly. And it really changed how we think about the future of work. Because during that period, during very high unemployment, as you all know, people had to stay home, and businesses and workers were looking for other ways to engage economically. And they developed and really emphasized and learned the exact kind of technology that you are engaging with right now, which are these types of digital distance seminars. And so that gave rise to much more remote work, which we'll talk about. It gave rise to a diversification of skills. It affected the business real estate market in very significant ways because the demand for business real estate fell dramatically. And it also got people to rethink about how they want to engage with their employers, not just in terms of where they wanted to work, but how they wanted to work. And there was a very noticeable change in people's attitudes towards the employer-employee relationship. One of the biggest things that changed was that people started to reassess in a very real way what is important to them in their lives. And do they want to work in a place that doesn't provide the kind of satisfaction that they desire? They want to get more out of life. And one of the key things about the future of work, whether you're an employee or an employer, that comes out of that experience is that people are much more concerned about creating a positive impact in the workplace, a positive work environment, a positive experience for the workers. And workers, if they don't get that, are much more likely to leave and go look for a much more pleasant or accommodating work environment. And that has been one of the significant changes going forward. And employers realize that. And if you look at Forbes, or if you look at McKinsey, or if you look at these other business type of prognosticators and analysts, they all recognize that there's been a very significant shift in the employer-employee relationship in that regard, that people are much more sensitive to adverse working conditions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But the COVID-19 really is a dividing time for the future of work. And I think going forward, it's important to put that in context. The other thing, obviously, to mention is that employment also varies a lot by demographic groups in the United States, for example. Different demographic groups have different unemployment rates. And that's one of the things that you'll notice is in this graph is that there has been a convergence in these high unemployment rates for what we say is Black Americans. And they had very high rates of employment, but there's been more of a convergence in the last decade. And what this really implies is that employers are now recognizing that workplaces are becoming more diverse. And this is coming from two particular sources. The first source is that within countries with migration and other historical trends, and actually just a change in social attitudes, workplaces are becoming much more diversified and they're becoming more diverse. And that is an important characteristic. The second one, of course, is with the increase in international engagement, people are engaging with people from many, many different cultures, even if the different cultures are not in your immediate community, which they probably are increasingly. Engaging with these other communities around the world also helps people realize the value of skills is not held by as a monopoly by any particular group. So there's skills and talent all over the world in every kind of demographic group. And that means that employers realize this, and they're becoming much more sensitive to reaching out and identifying a more diverse talent pool. So what this means, of course, for the future of work is that work is going to become increasingly diverse. I mean, that's just extrapolating from the current trend. And that also means that we're going to find talent in places that historically had been undervalued. And so employers recognize this. Moving forward, being able to obviously engage with different demographic groups, learning different languages or learning different cultures or that sort of thing will become increasingly valuable to you as a potential worker moving forward. And I think that's a key thing about the future of work that we would think about. The other thing that I just wanted to throw in here, just taking the professor's prerogative, is that one of the complaints about the US economy in particular, and this is also happening around the world in many countries, is there's a lot of concern about inflation. And that's been maybe the main complaint, but many have about the current US economy. But I know people all around the world have been experiencing inflation for a number of reasons, right? There was a spike in food prices, there was a spike in farming inputs, the price of farming inputs over the last couple of years. We also saw that the COVID-19 had a significant, what we call supply chain disruption. And I'll talk about this, but I'd mention a little bit more later. But I'd already mentioned that globalization is an increasingly important characteristic of the global economy and our day-to-day work lives. And that means in the supply chain sense that people are relying increasingly on foreign sources of inputs. And the COVID-19 crisis created a very significant disruption to accessing those inputs. As a result, the prices went up all around the world, shortages occurred, and led to a very significant increase in inflation. My main point to you, of course, is that yes, inflation was significant, but if you look at either cross-country examples, you think about Brazil, or you think about I was in Nicaragua in 1990, and I was in Mexico in 1986, where they had episodes of over 100% inflation per year. The current inflation rates in most countries is not in the hyperinflation category, and it's relatively low by historical standards, even though most people don't realize that. So I just was trying to, with this slide, hope to point out that people are very nervous about work, they're worried about wages, they're worried about keeping up with inflation, and all of that is valid. I respect all of those feelings. But one thing to just keep in mind is that the inflation is not the kind of hyperinflationary episodes that we have experienced in the past. So you just want to keep inflation in perspective is my main point. Now, when we talk about the future of work, one of the key things people focus on is manufacturing. And the reason why manufacturing is so important when we think about the future of work is really for several reasons. Number one is that manufacturing employment has been the gateway to middle-class jobs in the United States and in many other countries for much of the last 100 years. And people with relatively little education could earn very significant middle-class wages, like be squarely in the middle class, by going directly into manufacturing jobs. And one of the key problems in the United States has been a very dramatic decline in manufacturing employment over the last 25 years. And there's a lot of potential reasons for that. Partly it's going to be technology, which we're going to come back to in a minute, but also international competition. The United States obviously is very worried about China, and they put a lot of blame on China for the competition with China and the loss of manufacturing employment. But it's been very significant impact on the middle class in the United States. And the reason why I mentioned this is because the restructuring of globalization that has been occurring over the last 15 years or so has made people reassess the ability of manufacturing to create jobs for less educated people, and therefore maybe threaten the potential for less educated workers to move into the middle class. And so we're trying to figure out now what changes in manufacturing are occurring around the world. Where are there still opportunities for manufacturing to make that difference for potential middle class, less educated workers? And how can we structure our international provides gateways for people to get into the middle class? And because of a lot of that work and thought has gone into that, we have seen a rebound here in manufacturing employment in the US. But in terms of the future of work, it has fundamentally changed so that these are not as low skill kind of jobs as they were in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. These are much more, in the United States, high-tech jobs. And the manufacturing production distribution of low-skill jobs to high-skill jobs is now spread around the world. And the United States is starting to adapt to get more into the high-skill kind of production. And that is creating opportunities for other countries to move into different parts of the supply chain based on their available skills. And again, that goes back to this idea that thinking globally about your future careers and thinking globally about the skills, it's really important to connect those two. Like, what kind of skills are going to be in demand? What kind of jobs are going to be available in the global economy if I want to make it into the but we do see this rebound, and we do see a very significant decline, and jobs are, as you can see here, compared to 2000, much less likely to be in manufacturing than they were, 25 years ago in the United States. So, as I mentioned before, there's a supply chain disruption, right? And this happened during COVID, so that retail sales in the United States fell, almost 9%. Orders to developing countries stopped with and without pay. So that supply chain disruption had a very significant impact on developing countries like Bangladesh, where factories, were expecting to produce and get paid for the stuff they made and pay their workers, and that didn't happen. And so there was a big concern about people falling into poverty, right? So, what were these policy responses? Well, I just want to let you know that in the United States, at least, there was a much more significant shift towards bringing some of that production back to the United States, particularly in semiconductors, which is very well known, and trying to reshore or nearshore a lot of that production, which would bring back some of those manufacturing jobs, but in a very different way. So, when we think about the future of work and what industries are going to be growing, the key thing that's happening right now is a very significant reshuffling of global supply chains that creates opportunities for enterprising young people who might be interested in starting a business or engaging in supply chains in a different way, right? So businesses are trying to eliminate reducing risk. They're trying to eliminate or reduce risk in the supply chain from the disruptions, but also trying to build in a little bit more redundancy, which again creates more opportunities for production within those supply chains. And I think that's actually pretty important. So the other thing, though, that I did want to emphasize is that just to highlight this globalization issue, is that our economies are, and by say our, I mean all the world's economies, not any particular pair, but are increasingly engaged with others. If you look at countries that neighbor Russia, right, I know that they are highly dependent economically on the Russian economy. And if you look at Mexico, for example, it's highly dependent on the US economy, even so much as to say, and I'm making a very bold statement here, but this is based on my own published research, that the United States and the Mexican economy are actually a single economy at this point. It's a single labor market. And I'm just illustrating that kind of relationship in this graph, where people would argue that, for example, Russia might be competing for jobs from its lower wage neighbors, or that the United States competes with Mexico for low wage employment. And my point here is that that is a very incorrect assumption, that is very wrong. And the reason why it's very wrong is that supply chains have evolved to the point where the integration actually makes us into a single economy. And that means, in economic terms, that you, as a worker perhaps in Russia, are not so much a substitute for a worker in a neighboring country as you potentially are a complement. The workers in the United States and Mexico, for example, are very strong complements in the sense that their employment doesn't move in opposite directions. We don't see falling employment in the US and rising employment in Mexico as jobs move from the United States to Mexico. That's not the trend. If you look at these are production worker hours in the US, the dashed red line is US production workers, and the solid blue line is Mexican production workers. They're highly correlated. They move together because they are both part of the same production process. And that's what I'm saying. When we think about this future of work, you want to get away from this idea of competing with other countries. And instead, you want to think about how we are complements with other countries, and engaging with other countries can make us more productive, more successful, and potentially increase our income. So that economies are much more likely today to be integrated and part of the same economy than they were obviously 80 years ago, but than most people think that they are today. So that type of integration is something that's going to continue to move forward, even though we have this nearshoring trend, even though we have a pull for bringing production back to the United States and disrupting supply chains. We're not going to be able to eliminate the deep integration that production networks have formed across countries. So when you're thinking about the future of work, it's very important that you continue to think about integrating with other countries. So what are some of these other trends? And I know that a lot of you, when you think about the future of work, the first thing that most, McKinsey or Forbes or, any of these other popular outlets say is they talk immediately about AI. And many of you are probably shocked that I haven't mentioned AI yet, but I was kind of saving that for the end. So that AI here is on this list that Bernard Marr, who's an author online, you can look it up, but he put out that there's a number of 8 key trends here about the future of work, and AI is the one most of you are probably thinking of. AI that can write essays. I'm a professor, and I've already noticed that people think AI can write essays. They can create images. They can answer questions. They can solve errors in your code if you're coding. Lots of people use AI for that. And so there's a big debate about whether or not AI actually is a threat to workers or whether or not it's going to be a complement. And my key message for you today is that it is critical for you when thinking about the future of work to seize AI now and get ahead of that. Being able to harness the power of AI will increase your productivity and make you more productive going in the future. I'm going to give you a real simple example of that because I don't know your careers or your jobs. But one of the key things that people have been talking about is that AI, like ChatGPT or something like that, can actually help people deal with rising bureaucratic requirements. That businesses are becoming increasingly bureaucratic. There's increasing requirements for reporting, and the ChatGPT and generative AI can really help the mid-level managers with compliance and actually make those workers more productive. So that's an example of how AI, rather than replacing workers, could actually help make workers more productive, especially in service industries, management positions, and other types of occupations like that. So, I would come down on the side that AI is actually potentially going to help workers and make us more productive. But that hasn't happened yet. We don't see rising productivity, and the latest productivity statistics suggest that productivity actually has been falling, and I can talk a little bit about that. But there's the key thing that I would like to leave with you is that get out in front of the AI now, learn how to use it, learn how to harness it and help it, learn how to help you become a better, more productive worker. And that's going to be the best way to stay ahead of the AI trend. Now, of course, there's seven others that Bernard Marr points out. Number one is this decentralized work. And I talked about that a little bit already when I talked about the COVID crisis, right? That people now are more likely to work from home, not everywhere, but rising technologies like this webcam and this type of production we have now help people do things like I'm doing right now, which is talking to you from my home, as you can see. The other thing is lifelong learning. And this is another key message that has permeated my comments to you today, that you're not done learning, that technology is changing so quickly that it's really critical that you try to stay out in front, that you continually update your skills, and that you stay out in front of these trends. Because, digitalization is another example where technology of digitalization is constantly changing, and you want to stay out in front of that. The other, key trend here is demographics, and I've already touched on this as well, that the demographic trends are changing quite a bit, and being able to engage and flourish in a diverse workplace is going to become increasingly important. I've already also mentioned this experience idea that workers want an increasingly positive experience at work. Workers don't want to be in a sweatshop with unpleasant conditions. They want more say. They want more, be able to give more input. They want better relationships with their supervisors. They want a better work environment. And these are things that employers are already taking notice of. I've already also talked about future skills. I've been repeating that throughout. And the one thing I haven't mentioned as much, which is also a key trend here that I would like to share with you, is sustainability. And what that means is around the world, countries are trying to either reduce greenhouse emissions or reduce particulate matter in their cities or make water cleaner or increase the health of their workers in different ways. And most people don't realize this, but the European Union has been making a very significant and successful push towards holding businesses accountable for sustainability requirements throughout their entire supply chain. It's called due diligence. And this is going to become increasingly important around the world, which means that we need more sustainability officers and people who can evaluate sustainability. That's one of the reasons why at the Bush School at Texas A&M in Texas, College Station, at the Mosbacher Institute, we're launching a new training program partnering with the Responsible Business Alliance, RBI, to train students in those skills where they will go into factories and be able to help them increase their compliance, their sustainability, both in terms of workers, worker rights, and also in terms of the environment. So these are critical skills that are going to become increasingly in demand. And we want to make sure that we're providing those skills. So I'm doing my part. And I invite any of you who are interested to check out the Bush School and our master's program in international affairs. But in addition, we also want to spread that message worldwide that there's an increasingly important push for sustainability that's coming. And it's important that you prepare for that by getting skills that you need, but also thinking about those areas as potential career opportunities. So the last thing I think that I want to mention, and this is something that I think most of you may have had in mind when you tuned in tonight, and that is jobs. Like what jobs are going to be out there? What jobs are growing? So I have two main points before I jump into this list. But number one is that because of globalization and because of the specialization of production throughout global supply chains, the exact type of jobs that are going to be expanding in the near future vary country by country. So some types of jobs are going to be growing in some countries, other types of jobs will be growing in other countries. So it's really critical that you check in with some of your local economists to try and understand the local labor market trends that are most relevant for you. I'm going to talk about some of the broad global categories in this list, as you can see. But again, touching base with local economists and people who are following your local labor market would be really helpful for the future of work, because it's going to be a big shift across countries. But what are some of the generic categories people are thinking about when they think about the future of work, especially the growth of different jobs? Well, one is clearly e-commerce, right? And that involves a wide range of skills, but we've seen just an explosion of e-commerce platforms that has really transformed the way we think about retail sales. Retail stores are closing all across the United States, I guess all around the world, because e-commerce has been largely satisfying consumer demands. Key trend, and trying to get ahead of that by learning e-commerce skills or maybe thinking about becoming an entrepreneur yourself and starting an e-commerce platform, I think is really important. And I don't know who all's out there or what you're interested in, but this is also a huge potential for people who or want to engage with developing countries. And developing countries are able to take advantage of these e-commerce platforms and others to leapfrog, to jump over and jump ahead of traditional networks in a way that would be very profitable in developing countries, because you might not have a transportation infrastructure, but if you have a webcam and maybe a computer, you can get around a lot of that and actually start marketing directly to consumers around the world, whether it's handicrafts, clothing, other types of products, mangoes or whatever, in order to connect directly with your customers in a way that would be very profitable for you. So that's one way to think about the future of work, is that it's going to become much more independent. E-commerce is going to allow much more entrepreneurship, and getting out in front of that is a potentially very lucrative path. The next one is something I've already talked about, which is the green jobs, right? So there's going to be an increasing demand for producing, cleaning, caring for things like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and that sort of generation. We know that recycling is also going to become increasingly important, disposal. And so when you think about these types of engineering paths or other types of jobs, even all the way throughout those industries, keeping in mind the growth and demand for green jobs is very, very significant. And trying to figure out a way to maybe think about that as a career would make you much more marketable in the future. I've already talked about remote work, right? I mean, like, working from home and trying to start businesses maybe from your own home or just getting work done remotely. That's going to become, that has become very important, especially since COVID, but it's going to become increasingly important because businesses are relying on that. There has been some recent pushback. Businesses are starting to call workers back to the office because that face-to-face interaction is important. But it doesn't mean that remote work is going away by any stretch of the imagination. And so that's an important key thing to think about is where do you want to work and what type of jobs would allow you to work where you want to be. The other one, and this is really critical, I've just finishing up a report in Jordan with the World Bank about Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon. And one of the key pushes, and I also am doing work in Pakistan as well, and one of the key thrusts that development agencies have and others have is this idea of freelance work, right? So you're changing the traditional employer-employee relationship by going into freelance work. And talk about the gig economy, you think of like an Uber driver that you have your own car and you sign up on this platform and you become sort of kind of employee but kind of entrepreneur. And that's what this freelance work is like. And there's many different things: graphic design, different types of programming, software design, services can be done this way. Transportations, obviously, I could go on and on. There's lots of different examples, but increasingly people are thinking about freelance work as opposed to the traditional employment relationship. And so when you're thinking about the future of work, you want to start reframing how you think about that employer relationship in order to capture some of those. In order to do that type of thing, portable skills are going to be valued by many firms. It turns out that, more than 70% of many firms actually the value that the value of their final goods is actually generated by people outside their firm. So we used to call this subcontracting or outsourcing. And having those types of skills to engage with firms is also going to become increasingly important. But my last message here, and I have about just a minute or two left, is really what I'm hoping that you'll take away from this when we think about the future of work is that it's really critical that you keep investing in yourself, that you keep developing skills and you're able to go ahead and make yourself more productive and find these relationships that are going to be very important going forward in the context that I've laid out. Things are changing dramatically, and I think it's important that we stay ahead of those trends. But the best way that you could stay ahead of those trends is to invest in yourself continuously, continue your skill investment, and keep your eyes open for opportunities. So I was asked to speak about 45 minutes, starting around noon, and we're right up at the 45-minute mark. So I'd like to switch now and go in to take any of your questions. We have the last 15 minutes for questions. One of the questions that I've already seen in the chat is whether or not AI is going to lead to unemployment. So I have two responses to that. Number one is that when you look at that drop in manufacturing employment in the US, and you do see rising unemployment, a lot of people have blamed globalization, but the economists that have carefully looked at the change in employment, a lot of that was due to technology. So it led to a lot of unemployment in the United States. Mechanization, robots, that sort of thing have really contributed to job loss, job shifting, displacement. And it's been very significant. Now, will AI have that same effect? Well, one of the things that I think is happening, and I mentioned this a little bit, is that mechanization is going to be a very significant threat for manufacturing around the world. So I work a lot with like Bangladeshi apparel producers, And there's a lot of fear there that mechanization, women who are working in garment factories, but that's mainly robots. That's not so much AI, right? So the AI might lead to some unemployment. You know what I mean? Obviously, I mean, it'd be ridiculous to say it's not going to lead to some, but I also think the potential for people to seize AI to help them do their jobs better is more significant than a robot who's going to do exactly what you did, right? So AI is different than robots because AI is really about how you do your job, not what you do. And so I'm much more optimistic about the potential for AI to be a complement to workers rather than a substitute. So, so one of the things, another question that I see in the chat, and I'm going to go through these, is that much has been said about employees being far more spirited and less willing to put up with poor working conditions, right, post-COVID around the world. And I'm going to give you a story about this that really affected me. I'm actually working with some sugar plantations, some sugar growers in Central America, and we're trying to address the rise in chronic kidney disease of non-traditional origins by helping firms provide water, rest, and shade. And that's because heat. And I was talking to a supervisor, and he was talking about these cane cutters, and he said he's been there for 35 years. And I asked him, I was like, wow, 35 years? You must have seen a lot of changes in the industry. And he said, yes, I've seen a lot. And one of the most significant changes I've seen is that these workers today don't take the craft seriously. They don't want to work as hard. They're not as serious about it. And, they're less tolerant of poor working conditions. So this has been something that I know has been present throughout the Americas, at least. But in other places, it's hard to imagine that it's not as significant. But if you go to places like Southeast Asia, South Asia, people don't have the kind of alternatives that they have had, and so it's a lot more difficult to be intolerant of poor working conditions when your options are fewer. And so it'd be interesting to see, I think, as a research question, how much that is spread around the world. I'm going to try and go through, let's see, another one here. Yeah, employers are scared of that trend, right? So this idea that workers are becoming much more independent. Workers were able to be much more independent in the US because the United States government provided a lot of supplementary income due to the COVID crisis, right? So during the COVID crisis, there were these significant payout programs, and employers didn't really realize that employees receiving this money would become much more choosy, right? So employers are very scared of this trend, but the result has been really a shift towards making environments more or less uncomfortable, let's just say that, but also trying to lure them with higher wages. And we do see wages going up. That's got to be just supply and demand. When the supply falls, wages are going to go up. Employers have to offer higher wages, and that's been one of the ways that they've been compensating. The other big problem, of course, with the falling supply in the United States, which makes it better for workers to be more choosy because there's fewer workers around, has been the reduction in migration, right? So that's also been a contributing factor. Now, there's another big question, right, is that productivity has been falling in the US. And one of the concerns that employers have is that the remote work makes it more difficult to monitor workers. Like, when we're done with this, I'm probably going to head to the refrigerator and get something to drink in a way that I couldn't do if I was in an office. You know what I'm saying? So measuring that, some people have argued that the measurement of productivity then needs to be reassessed. It's not just like the number of clicks or not just the number of widgets you're putting out per hour, right? We want to rethink how we measure productivity as a way to maybe understand the decline in productivity that we've seen. And productivity has been falling, but one of the problems, I think, is that, as I've showed in the graph, is that the manufacturing component of our economy in the United States has declined, and that's been largely replaced with services. And it's very difficult to measure service output in the same way. Like, you can measure a haircut, but not all haircuts are going to be the same, right? I mean, if you cut my hair versus somebody else's hair, it's not the same haircut. And so we're trying to find ways to rethink productivity and how we measure productivity. And that is hopefully that's just a new area for research. I think we're still in that and important. Um, So another question that came up in the chat, which is a great one, which is about fusion. And I don't know if people are movie fans, but there's always different kind of movies that talk about the potential for cold fusion, and they sort of make that a subplot. One of my favorites had that as a subplot. And I'm not a physicist. I'm not a nuclear scientist. I'm an economist, and so I'd like to think that fusion is a potential, but I think that nuclear, more specifically, will become increasingly important over the next 20 years. And I know that there's been incredible technological advances in what's called small modular reactors, or SMRs, which can be placed in neighborhoods. And because of their size, they're much more easy to contain. They're less dangerous. They can provide local energy in a much more efficient way, and obviously it's much more green. So obviously I don't really know about where we are in fusion research, but I know that there's been huge advances in nuclear research that allow for innovations. The only problem, of course, is that it's still very unpopular, and people in Europe and in the United States are still very skeptical of it because they might not be up to date on the science. So that's why I encourage this continuous learning and making sure that we put facts first above ideology in a way that would allow us to make much better policy decisions. And so I'm just saying, put facts first. I think that'd be great. Um, so one of the other questions that came up, which I think is a really great question, is mobility and flexibility are obviously priorities to be employed, right? But stability as a platform for human psychological well-being is also very important to keep in mind. The reason why is that there are, in economics and labor economics in particular, moving costs are incredibly significant to people. And to put that in a more straightforward way, people hate moving. People hate losing their job. People hate going from place to place because it's expensive and it takes a lot of energy. And so, as a result of that, human beings around the world, uh, to differing degrees, but around the world, place a very significant value on security and stability. And that's why in places like Japan, right, we see these long-term employment relationships being highly valued by the Japanese people. And it also, generally speaking, obviously not everybody, but generally, as a characteristic of their economy. And we also see this in other places. Like I've actually done the actual estimations for these adjustment costs for what it costs for workers to move between jobs. And they vary, but they can be as much as 2 or 3 times annual income. And what that means is that even though mobility and flexibility are priorities in the new gig economy, historically, people have been willing to accept lower wages uh, as long as they didn't have to move. And what I mean by that is that I've seen in my own research that people don't always leave their jobs to take a higher paying job somewhere else because they don't want to look for that job. They might not know about it, but even if they knew about it, moving is very expensive and it's difficult. You leave an environment that you're comfortable with, right? And so I think that this mobility, flexibility that we're seeing in the current gig economy is important. I think it can contribute to productivity. I think people can maybe find a better match. But at the end of the day, I think it's very likely that we will see some backlash against that, and people will want to settle into more stable relationships. Just, starting a career in your 20s, it's easy and fun to move all around, go around the world and do these different things. But as people get older, they're much more likely to want to settle down and stay in one place. And I think that's going to show up in the labor market as the current millennials get older. Let's take another one, which is, if you're a marketer by profession, if you should have an additional working profession in case of a crisis, like should you have a backup type of job? And, um, one of the things I would say is that's probably a good idea for some people for sure. And I know that some people have lost their jobs and it's very traumatic when you lose a job. But it creates an opportunity in some cases for people to do something, to try something that they've always wanted to do, to pursue a dream. And so if you think that there is something that you would really like to be doing on the side, having those additional skills and continuously investing in those skills is probably a good idea just in case. I think it's a good idea to have that kind of a backup or to have a plan. So what are some of the employers? Like I've talked a lot about employees because a lot of my work is focused on kind of working people. But what about employers and policymakers? I mean, one of the things that we've noticed is that number one, in Europe, there is a much more important push for sustainability, improving working conditions. We know that policymakers, like in the United States government, I work a little bit with the International Labor Affairs Bureau. They've been doing a great job to really be promoting labor rights around the world. And what they, are trying to do is improve working conditions all around the world and help people try to lead better lives and have better employment relationships. And employers, I was in Cambodia and I was in a garment factory. And I'm going to tell you that this was a pretty impressive that I asked him, I was like, do you have a hard time finding workers or how difficult it is to find workers? Because other places are saying they're having a very difficult time. And he told me in Cambodia at this factory, he's like, no, I have no problem with finding workers and people, once they work here, don't leave because I guarantee better working conditions. I treat my workers really well. I pay them well. And that actually creates an environment with more loyalty. So it's cheaper for me. People are trained. They can invest more in their own skills. They become more productive. So improving working conditions on the employer side actually is profitable. And that's been one of the messages from other research studies that I've done and seen in the literature. The employers that make better working conditions for their workers actually are more successful businesses. They become more profitable. So that's really critical, I think, going forward. And then we have another question here about invest in, like soft skills or hard skills, and what are the most important soft skills for the future? And I'm going to actually bring us back to a report that the United States government did in the 1980s or early 1990s. It was around that time it was America's Choice, high skills or low wages. And the whole point there was they surveyed a whole bunch of employers, and employers predominantly said that there's a significant shortage of soft skills, being able to trust the workers and having them show up on time. And that type of skill was incredibly important to employers. And that's why these types of soft skills are actually undervalued by workers. And it's important to continually try to figure out how you can get more of those soft skills. Hard skills are very straightforward, right? If you're an engineer, you know how to run a computer-assisted design or something. But those soft skills are a little bit more tricky, and finding ways to improve those makes you much more marketable going into the future of work. I think we're right about the end of the hour. I really want to thank you for tuning in. It's been a real pleasure being here with you, and I appreciate the mission of learn, connect, and produce. That's really critical going forward. And my name is Raymond Robertson. I'm the director of the Mosbacher Institute at Texas A&M. My email is robertson@tamu.edu, and I'd love to hear from you. And if there's anything I can do to follow up, let me know. Thanks again for the opportunity. Hope you all have a wonderful evening.